Okay, so let's get started with the grid. To begin, I'm going to duplicate the Flexbox project folder and then rename this the grid. So over to the desktop or the location where you saved your project, I'm going to duplicate this project. And then once that's done, let's rename this the grid. Open this up in Visual Studio Code. And then we can also open up the index.html inside of the browser. This will save us setting up all the boilerplate HTML code, which we need to get started. So let's go over to the index.html. And we can close this sidebar down. And then make some changes to clean this up. So the title of grid. And then we can remove all the styles from the container. Just leaving in this background color, we can also reuse this. We'll also reuse the item 2, so let's remove the flex properties, leaving in just the background color, and also the padding is fine. Down to the div, we'll again use the div container and also the individual items, so let's just remove the style property from inside there. And then we're good to go. Good, so just like with the Flexbox, first we need to change the display type of the container, but this time, rather than set it to be flex, we use the grid. So display with the type of grid. And let's see what happens over in the browser. If we reload, we don't see any changes as of yet. When we set the grid, the child items of the container are block level, so they're the full width of the page. If we want the items to be in line, we can change the grid type to be inline. So let's go over to here and change this to be inline grid. Reload, and then all the items are now inline rather than block. I'm going to stick with grid for now though. So let's remove this inline and restore this back to normal. To then declare how we want these items to be laid out, we set the number of columns and rows that we want to use. I'm going to start with the columns, and this is done inside of the main container. We do this with a CSS property called grid template columns. And then I'm going to set this to be 100 pixels. And over to the browser. Okay, so to see these items better, let's add a border around the outside of each. And this needs to be done inside the items. So just a simple border of 1 pixel and a solid line. There we go. We've only specified one column at the moment, which is 100 pixels wide. This is why we see them all stacked in one column like this. If we want more than one column, we specify more numbers. So just after the 100 pixels for the grid template columns, let's add a second column of 300 pixels and then a third one at 80. And this is how this looks in the browser. We've specified 3 sizes here. So the first 3 items have these sizes. So we have the first one at 100, then 300, and then 80. Then any extra items will be repeated, like we see for this 4th item down here, which falls into the first column of 100 pixels. This can be better seen with more items. So let's go down to the HTML, and we can duplicate one of these divs. So let's paste this in a couple more times. So 5, 6, and then 7. And there's our repeated items on the second row. And then we're left with one extra item which defaults to the first column. These columns and also rows, which we'll look at next, are known as tracks. So at the moment we have a 100 pixels wide track, a 300 pixels wide track, and then an 80 pixel wide track on the right. Also, these don't need to be sized in pixels either. We can use things we already know, such as %, m, or even auto, to automatically take up the remaining space. So rather than 80 pixels here, we can set this third track to be auto. And then this third track will automatically take up the remaining space. Now onto rows. At the moment, the height of each one of these rows is set by the content. This includes the padding too. Using Visual Studio Code, we can add some sample text called lorem ipsum. So let's go down to one of our items. Let's say item 2. And if we type lorem with a tab, we then get some more text content. So let's see what effect this has in the browser. And this first row is now taller because of the extra content. We don't always want this though. We often want to have control over this ourselves. This is where grid template rows comes in. If we go back over to our container, we can also set the grid template rows. And let's set this to be a value of 100 pixels. Then back over. And all 3 rows are now set to 100 pixels high. So now the content is no longer in control of the height because we've set it to be exactly what we want. Just like columns, only setting one value will only affect the first row. So we can go ahead and add more values. So let's go ahead and add the first one. Let's say 250 pixels, 150 pixels, and then 100. Okay, good. So now we have 3 individually sized row tracks. In just a few lines, we have controlled the layout for our content in 2 dimensions, using both columns and rows. This is in contrast to the Flexbox, which is designed to be only used on 1 dimension at a time, either a row or a column. This is our first look at the grid. There is so much more still to cover though, and we'll continue in the next video.